On a frozen street in small-town America, a 45-year-old man in a worn brown leather jacket stopped for one reason he couldn't explain. An old man sat shaking in the snow beside a retired German Shepherd police dog, a cardboard sign hanging from the collar. $5 for sale. But this wasn't a sale. It was a goodbye. The dog had once saved lives. Now its owner was selling him to survive the winter. What the man did next broke every unspoken rule and uncovered a truth that would change all of them forever. Stay with this story, because some heroes never stop protecting even when the badge is gone. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on the small Montana town like a held breath, the air sharp and colorless snow drifting in slow, relentless sheets across streets that felt abandoned by the world. Daniel Walker moved through the silence with the heavy, practiced steps of a man who had learned to walk carefully through life. At 45, his face carried sharp angles softened by fatigue, a square jaw shadowed with dark stubble that never quite disappeared even when he shaved. His eyes were steady, observant, the kind that noticed small details others missed, a habit carved into him during his years as a police officer. He wore a dark brown leather jacket, thick and cracked with age, its creases shaped by decades of cold mornings and long nights. Beneath it, a red and navy flannel peeked through, faded but clean. His jeans were worn pale at the knees, his boots heavy leather built to fight ice and wind, and a gray wool scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. Daniel walked like someone who expected the ground beneath him to give way at any moment, not from fear, but from experience. He no longer wore a badge. A back injury from a call years ago had ended his career sooner than he was ready for, leaving him to work night security patrols and morning checks, jobs that paid less, but kept him moving, kept him useful. The town knew him as quiet, dependable, a man who nodded more than he spoke. Few knew how much silence he carried inside, or how often he replayed old moments he wished he could have changed. As Daniel passed the rusted fence of the old park, something tugged at his awareness. He slowed his breath, fogging the air boots crunching softly in the snow. At the far end of the bench line, almost swallowed by white, sat a figure that did not belong there. An old man, thin to the point of fragility, hunched forward as if folding himself smaller against the cold. His coat was too light for winter, the fabric stiff with age, and his gloved hands trembled as they rested on his knees. His face was deeply lined skin, weathered, and pale gray whiskers clinging to his jaw, and upper lip eyes clouded not just by years, but by exhaustion. Beside him sat a German Shepherd. Large, broad-chested, his black and tan coat, dulled by age, but still thick, still strong. A frayed blanket had been wrapped carefully around his back, tied clumsily beneath his chest. Snow dusted his ears and muzzle, but his posture was unmistakable. He sat upright, spine straight, muscles, engaged eyes alert and calculating. This was not the relaxed posture of a stray or a neglected pet. This was discipline, training, memory written into muscle. Daniel stopped. His instincts, dulled only by time not gone, flared quietly. He noticed the dog first, not the man. The way the animal tracked his movement without aggression. The way his tail stayed still, not tucked, not wagging. The way his body leaned subtly toward the old man, protective without being reactive. Daniel had worked with K-9 units long enough to recognize the signs. This dog had once worn a harness and a purpose. As Daniel stepped closer, he saw the sign. A piece of cardboard, edges soft and bent from moisture, tied to the dog's collar with thin string. The words were written in uneven black marker. $5, for sale. The price meant nothing to him. $5 was absurd, meaningless. What stopped him cold was the fact that the sign existed at all. No one sold a trained German Shepherd for $5 unless money was no longer the point. The old man lifted his head slowly. His movements were stiff, deliberate, like someone rationing energy. His voice when he spoke was rough and thin, scraped raw by cold air and disuse. "Sir," he said, eyes flicking briefly to Daniel's jacket, then back to the ground. Can you buy this dog?" Daniel felt something tighten behind his ribs. He crouched slightly, not kneeling, yet keeping his body non-threatening, his voice calm. "That's a fine dog," he said. "Why are you selling him?" The old man swallowed, his fingers tightening on the blanket wrapped around the dog. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked down his shoulders, slumping further. "He used to belong to my son," he said quietly. "Police dog. K9. My boy worked with him for years." His lips trembled, whether from cold or memory, Daniel could not tell. "My son's gone now. The dog's all I have left." The German Shepherd shifted slightly, pressing closer to the man's leg. A low sound rumbled in his chest, not a growl but a warning meant for distance rather than conflict. Daniel froze, respecting the boundary, his heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to warrant. Wind surged down the street, sharp and sudden, flinging snow into their faces. The old man winced, curling inward. The dog responded instantly, adjusting his position, angling his body to shield the man from the worst of it. Daniel watched the movement closely, the precision, the instinct. This dog was old, but he was not broken. Daniel glanced again at the sign. $5. He thought of warm patrol cars, of radios crackling with backup on the way, of rules and procedures that once gave shape to the world. None of those applied here. This was not a transaction. It was not even desperation in the way he understood it. This was resignation. He straightened slowly, the snow creaking beneath his boots. The old man did not look up again. The dog did not relax. The street remained empty, the town holding its breath. Daniel realized with a certainty that settled deep in his chest that whatever came next would not be simple. He did not yet know what he would do, only that walking away would follow him longer than the cold ever could. The wind howled again, the sign tapping softly against the dog's collar, $5 swinging like a question no one wanted to answer. Cold clung to the outskirts of town like something alive, settling deeper with every step Daniel Walker took away from the main road. The wooden house sat alone at the edge of a frozen field, its outline slouched and tired, as if it had grown old alongside the man inside it. Snow had drifted high against the lower walls, sealing gaps in the warped boards, and the porch sagged slightly under Daniel's weight when he stepped onto it. The air felt heavier here, not just colder, but quieter, the kind of silence that came from being forgotten. Walter Brooks unlocked the door with stiff fingers, his hands shaking as much from age as from the cold. Up close, Daniel could see how fragile he was. Walter was 72, but he looked older. His frame was narrow, shoulders stooped forward from decades of bending over engines, his spine permanently curved by years of physical labor. His hair was thin and white, combed back neatly despite everything, and his face was carved with deep lines that spoke of long hours, responsibility, and loss. His eyes, pale blue and watery, held a stubborn sharpness beneath the fatigue, the look of a man who had survived by refusing to fall apart completely. The door creaked open, and a wave of cold air rolled out to meet them. Daniel stepped inside and immediately understood. It was colder in the house than it had been on the street. The heater sat in the corner, rusted and silent, its power cord unplugged and frayed. A single lamp flickered weakly near the couch, casting thin light across peeling walls and threadbare furniture. The smell of old wood oil and dust lingered in the air, familiar to Daniel, from garages and workshops long abandoned. Max entered last, pausing at the threshold, as if checking the space before committing. He moved carefully, his large body slower, now joints stiff but controlled. His muzzle was graying, especially around the eyes, which still carried intelligence and focus. The blanket slipped slightly from his back, and Walter reached down instinctively to adjust it, his hand resting there a moment longer than necessary. The dog leaned subtly into the touch, accepting comfort without demanding it. "I'm sorry," Walter said quietly, closing the door behind them. "I don't get visitors much." His voice carried no embarrassment, only fact. Daniel nodded, removing his gloves. "It's all right?" He glanced around again, cataloging what he saw with the same quiet assessment he used on patrols. Empty cupboards, a small kitchen table with one chair, a pile of folded blankets near the couch. No pictures on the walls except one faded photograph above a narrow shelf. Daniel stepped closer and looked at it. A younger Walter stood beside a tall man in a police uniform, his arms slung around the shoulders of a powerful German shepherd wearing a K9 harness. The man had a strong build, broad shoulders, dark hair cropped short, and a confident smile. There was pride in his posture, the easy confidence of someone who trusted his partner completely. "My son Walter," said softly, following Daniel's gaze. "Ethan." His voice wavered just enough to betray the weight of the name. He was a K9 officer. That dog was his partner. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He was a good officer. Walter nodded once. "The best kind? Quiet, steady, never rushed in without thinking." Max trusted him. "That's how I knew he was doing something right." He lowered himself slowly onto the couch, exhaling as if the movement itself cost him more than it should have. Daniel remained standing, his boots planted firmly on the cold floor. "What happened?" Walter stared at his hands. "Warehouse fire," he said. "Years back." Ethan went in after a trapped worker. Max pulled 2 people out before the roof came down. His jaw tightened. Ethan didn't make it back out. Silence filled the room, thick and unmovable. Max settled beside Walter's legs, lowering himself carefully, his body positioned between the old man and the open space of the room, as if guarding against something unseen. After that, Walter continued. Max was retired. They offered to take him back, place him somewhere else. His lips pressed into a thin line. But I couldn't let him go. He was all I had left of my boy. Daniel crouched slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "You took care of him?" he said, not a question. Walter gave a tired smile. "I tried." He gestured weakly around the room. "I was a mechanic my whole life. I knew how to fix engines, not paperwork. When my heart started acting up, I thought I could work through it." He shook his head. "Turns out you can't fix everything with your hands." Daniel noticed the small plastic bottle on the counter, nearly empty. Heart medication. He had seen enough of it to know what it meant. "You haven't been taking it," he said quietly. Walter didn't argue. "I had to choose," he replied simply. "Food, heat, medicine. Something always had to wait." Max lifted his head at the change, in tone, ears flicking forward, eyes moving between the 2 men. "And the sign?" Daniel asked. Walter closed his eyes briefly. "I never thought I'd do it," he said. "I promised Ethan I'd give Max a good life. Warm place, food, peace." His voice cracked. But last week his paws started cracking from the cold. He shivered at night, even with the blankets. I realized something. Daniel waited. "If I kept him," Walter whispered, "we might both die here." He looked down at Max, his hand trembling as it rested on the dog's head. He deserved better than that. He deserved someone who could keep him warm. Daniel felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not anger, but something heavier. Respect, "You weren't selling him," he said. "You were trying to save him." Walter nodded, tears pooling at the corners of his eyes. "A man who's lived this long shouldn't drag another life down with him." Max shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Walter's leg, steady and solid, as if disagreeing with every word. Daniel watched the dog carefully. Even now, even old Max's body language spoke of duty. He had not been abandoned. He had stayed. Daniel stood slowly, his joints protesting in the cold. He looked around the room again, seeing it clearly now. This wasn't neglect. It was endurance stretched to its breaking point. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, a reminder of how little time winter offered mercy. Daniel pulled his scarf tighter, his mind racing ahead, while his body stayed still. He had come here expecting to confirm what he already suspected. Instead, he found something more complicated. Walter hadn't failed. He had reached the edge of what one man could carry alone. Daniel looked at Max one more time, meeting the dog's steady gaze. There was no fear there, no confusion, only patience, worn thin but unbroken. Daniel inhaled slowly, the cold air stinging his lungs, and understood that whatever happened next would test more than rules or resources. It would test what kind of man he was willing to be. Night settled hard over the outskirts of town, the temperature dropping fast as wind pushed snow against the windows, like handfuls of salt thrown by an unseen hand. Daniel Walker sat at the small kitchen table, his coat still on, boots planted firmly on the cold floor. He had decided to stay without fully deciding it, the choice forming somewhere between conscience and instinct. The lamp above him flickered occasionally, its weak light stretching shadows across the room. He listened to the house breathe, the soft creaks of aging wood, the distant howl of wind slipping through unseen cracks. There was a rhythm to places like this. Daniel knew a fragile balance between standing and collapsing. Walter Brooks lay on the couch, bundled in layered blankets, his breathing uneven, but steady enough to pass for rest. Up close, Daniel could see how thin the old man had become. His chest rose shallowly, each breath measured, as if he were afraid of wasting air. His face, pale beneath the dim light, looked carved rather than aged, every line a record of effort and endurance. One hand rested loosely on his stomach, the other draped near the edge of the couch, fingers twitching faintly from time to time. Max lay on the floor beside him, close enough that his flank brushed the couch when he shifted. The German Shepherd was still but not relaxed. His ears twitched at every sound, eyes opening fully whenever the wind surged or the house groaned. His breathing was slow and controlled the way it had been trained to be. Daniel noticed how the dog positioned himself, angled slightly toward Walter's chest. Not the door, not the room. It was subtle, but deliberate. Daniel had seen this before years ago during late shifts and long nights. Canines never truly slept when their partner was vulnerable. They rested, but they watched. The clock ticked on the wall, loud in the quiet. Daniel rubbed his hands together, feeling the ache in his knuckles from the cold. He told himself he was staying to make sure Walter didn't fall during the night, that the heater didn't spark, that the house didn't swallow a man whole while no one was looking. But the truth pressed heavier. He stayed because leaving felt wrong. A sharp sound cut through the stillness, not loud, not sudden, just wrong. Max's head lifted instantly, his ears snapped forward, every muscle in his body tightening at once. He rose to his feet in a single smooth motion, the blanket sliding off his back. He took 2 quick steps toward the couch nose, close to Walter's chest, inhaling deeply. His tail stiffened. His posture changed completely, no hesitation, no confusion. Daniel felt his pulse jump. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, already standing. Max let out a short, urgent bark. Not aggressive, not frightened. It was precise, clipped the sound of an alert trained to cut through noise. He circled Walter once, then again, barking twice more louder, now his movements quick and purposeful. Walter stirred weakly. His chest hitched. His breath came shallow, rapid, then stalled for a frightening half-second. His fingers curled inward, knuckles whitening beneath the thin skin. Daniel moved fast. He dropped to one knee beside the couch, pressing 2 fingers gently to Walter's wrist. The pulse was there, but erratic, fluttering beneath his touch. "Walter," he said firmly, leaning close, "can you hear me?" Walter's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, then rolled back as his head slumped deeper into the cushions. His mouth opened slightly, a thin, rattling breath escaping with effort. Max barked again, louder now, his body angled protectively over Walter's legs. He nudged Walter's arm with his nose, then looked up at Daniel, eyes sharp and intent. There was no panic in them, only urgency. Daniel's training took over. He reached for his phone with steady hands already dialing. 911, he said, when the line connected, his voice calm, despite the surge of adrenaline. "I have an elderly male possible cardiac event. Breathing shallow, pulse irregular. We need an ambulance immediately." The dispatcher asked questions. Daniel answered them quickly, precisely, never taking his eyes off Walter. He adjusted the blankets, making sure the old man's chest was clear, his head tilted slightly to keep his airway open. Max stayed close, pressing his body against Walter's legs, positioning himself between the couch and the cold air seeping from the door. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the window frames. Snow piled higher against the house. Time stretched thin, each second heavy with consequence. Daniel spoke to Walter constantly, his voice steady, anchoring. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "Help's coming." Max did not leave his position. He stood firm, occasionally shifting to nudge Walter to bark once, when Walter's breathing faltered again. Each bark was measured, purposeful, a reminder, rather than a cry. Daniel realized with a sharp clarity that cut through the fear that Max had recognized the danger before any human could. The dog had not reacted. He had responded. Distant sirens cut through the night, faint at first, then growing louder. Daniel exhaled slowly, tension easing just enough to let him think again. "Good boy," he whispered to Max, placing a hand briefly on the dog's shoulder. The muscle beneath his palm was solid, steady. Max did not look away from Walter. Red and white lights flashed through the frosted windows moments later. The front door opened to the rush of cold air and hurried footsteps. 2 EMTs entered, moving with practiced efficiency. The first was a woman in her early 30s, tall and athletic, her dark hair pulled back tightly beneath her cap, her expression focused and composed. The second was an older man with a broad build and graying beard, his movements calm, reassuring eyes, scanning the room with experience-earned confidence. "What do we have?" the woman asked, already kneeling beside Walter. 72-year-old male Daniel replied. "History of heart issues. Onset about 5 minutes ago. Breathing shallow, pulse irregular." The EMTs worked quickly, checking vitals, fitting an oxygen mask, exchanging brief, efficient words. Max watched every movement closely, his body tense but controlled. When the woman shifted closer to Walter's chest, Max stepped forward, once placing himself between her and Walter, not aggressively but protectively. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, meeting Max's eyes. "They're helping him." Max hesitated, then took half a step back, staying close enough to touch. The EMT nodded slightly, understanding, without comment. As the stretcher was prepared, Walter stirred faintly, his eyes opening just enough to focus on Max. His lips moved, forming the dog's name without sound. Max leaned forward, immediately pressing his head gently against Walter's shoulder, a low, steady whine vibrating in his chest. The stretcher rolled toward the door. The cold rushed in again, sharper than before. Max followed, stopping at the threshold, refusing to move farther. Daniel watched him stand there, snow swirling around his legs, posture rigid, eyes locked on Walter as he was carried away. Max did not chase. He did not bark. He stood guard, as if holding the line between what had been and what might still be saved. Daniel stepped beside him, the sirens fading into the distance, and understood with certainty that Max had just completed another mission. Not with force, not with command, but with instinct sharpened by loyalty that time had never retired. Morning light crept weakly through the hospital windows, pale and cold, turning the long corridor into a narrow ribbon of gray and white. Daniel Walker stood near the nurse's station, hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark brown leather jacket, his scarf still wrapped tight around his neck, as if the cold from the night refused to let go of him. He had not slept. He had not truly sat down. The events of the night replayed in his mind in fragments: Max's bark, Walter's shallow breathing, the rush of sirens cutting through the storm. Now there was only waiting, and Daniel had learned long ago that waiting could be its own kind of punishment. Walter Brooks lay in a curtained emergency room bay, connected to machines that hummed softly, each sound a reminder of how thin the line between life and loss could be. His face looked even smaller against the hospital pillow, his skin washed pale under fluorescent light. A nasal oxygen tube rested beneath his nose, rising and falling with each shallow breath. The man who had once rebuilt engines with bare hands now seemed breakable, fragile, in a way that unsettled Daniel deeply. Max was not allowed inside the treatment area. He sat just outside the bay doors, lying perfectly still on the linoleum floor, his head resting between his paws, eyes fixed on the curtain, as if sheer fabric were the only thing standing between his partner and danger. Nurses walked past him carefully, instinctively sensing that this dog was not to be ignored or disturbed. One of them, a middle-aged nurse named Linda Morales, paused briefly as she passed. She was in her late 40s, medium height, sturdy build, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a practical bun. Years of night shifts had etched patience into her face, but her eyes softened when she looked at Max. "He hasn't moved," she said quietly to Daniel. Daniel shook his head. "He won't." Linda nodded, as if that explained everything. She had seen loyalty in many forms in her career, but this one felt different. A few minutes later, a hospital administrator approached Daniel. Thomas Reed was a thin man in his early 50s, wearing wire-rim glasses and a neatly pressed gray suit that looked out of place in the emergency wing. His posture was polite, but distant, the kind of professional composure built around delivering bad news without appearing cruel. "Mr. Walker," he said, glancing at his clipboard, "we need to discuss Mr. Brooks's situation." Daniel straightened slightly. "How is he? Stable for now," Reed replied. "But he'll need continued monitoring, medication, and possibly surgery if his condition worsens." He hesitated, then continued. "There's a problem regarding coverage." Daniel already knew what was coming. He nodded once. "Mr. Brooks doesn't have sufficient insurance," Reed said. "And according to our records, he has no immediate family listed as a guarantor." His voice remained calm, practiced. "We can't provide extended care without some form of assurance." Daniel looked past him toward the curtained bay, where Walter lay fighting quietly to breathe. "What does that mean?" "It means," Reed said carefully, "that unless arrangements are made, his care will be limited to emergency stabilization." Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This was the part no one warned you about. The place where compassion met policy, and policy almost always won. He thought of Walter, sitting on a frozen bench with a $5 sign trying to solve a problem no one else would touch. He thought of Max, standing guard in the snow, refusing to abandon his post. Reed cleared his throat. "You're listed as the individual who accompanied him," he said. "If you're unable to assist, we'll have to explore alternative options." Alternative options. Daniel had heard those words before. They usually meant waiting paperwork delays measured in weeks or months' time Walter did not have. Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced down at Max, who had lifted his head at the change in tone. The dog's eyes met his steady and searching, as if asking the same question fate had placed in front of Daniel. This was the line. He could step back, now return to being a stranger who had done enough by calling for help. No one would blame him. Or he could cross into something messier, heavier, personal. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Put the initial costs under my name," he said. Reed blinked. "I'm sorry, I'll guarantee the emergency care." Daniel repeated his voice, low but firm. "Whatever needs to be done to keep him stable." The administrator studied him, perhaps weighing the seriousness behind the words. "That's a significant responsibility," he said. "I know," Daniel replied. Reed nodded slowly and made a note on his clipboard. "We'll proceed then." He turned and walked away, already moving on to the next problem. Daniel stood still for a moment longer, his heart pounding harder than it had during the emergency. He felt exposed, as if he had stepped into open air without knowing where he would land. But beneath the fear was something else. Certainty. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began making calls. First to an old colleague from the police department, a retired sergeant with a gruff voice and a soft heart. Then to a local K-9 association he remembered from past fundraisers. Then to a veterans group that had once helped an officer Daniel knew after a line-of-duty injury. Each conversation started the same way with hesitation, and ended the same way with silence followed by resolve. By mid-morning, the story had begun to spread. An old man selling a retired police dog for $5 in the snow. A K-9 who refused to leave his partner. A stranger who stepped in when the system stalled. The town talked not out of pity, but recognition. People here understood service. They understood standing watch long after the shift ended. Max watched Daniel as he paced the corridor, phone pressed to his ear. When Daniel finally crouched beside him, rubbing the thick fur between his ears, Max leaned into the touch, his tail thumping once against the floor. "We're not done yet," Daniel murmured. Max exhaled slowly, resting his chin on Daniel's knee, as if acknowledging the truth. Daniel looked down the corridor again toward the curtained bay, and the man fighting quietly beyond it. He had crossed the line. There was no stepping back now. And for the first time since the night began, the choice felt heavier than fear, but lighter than regret. Winter still ruled the valley weeks later, but the air inside Walter Brooks's house no longer carried the bite of surrender. The old wooden walls held warmth now. A new heater hummed steadily in the corner, its sound low and reliable, filling the space with something Walter had not felt in a long time: safety. Snow still piled along the porch and drifted against the windows, but it no longer felt like an enemy waiting to break in. It was simply weather again, no longer a threat. Walter sat in his armchair near the window, a blanket resting lightly over his legs. He looked thinner than he once had, but the sharp edge of fragility had softened. Color had returned to his face, and his breathing, though slow, no longer fought for every inch of air. His pale blue eyes followed the quiet movements of the room, absorbing the small details with the appreciation of a man who understood how easily they could disappear. Max lay stretched out on the rug near the heater, his large frame relaxed in a way Daniel Walker had never seen before. The German Shepherd's muzzle had gone almost entirely gray now, his movements slower, joints stiff when he shifted, but there was peace in the way he slept. His ears twitched occasionally, responding to distant sounds, but he no longer felt the need to stand guard every second. The years had finally given him permission to rest. Daniel stood near the doorway, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had barely touched. He still wore his dark brown leather jacket out of habit, though he had taken off his scarf. The flannel beneath it looked brighter in the warmth, less worn. He had visited often over the past weeks, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes simply sitting in silence with Walter, while Max slept at their feet. He told himself he came to check on things, but the truth was simpler. He came because this place had become familiar, and familiarity felt rare. "You don't have to keep checking on me," Walter said quietly, a faint smile touching his lips. His voice was still rough, but stronger now. "I'm not going anywhere just yet." Daniel returned the smile, small and reserved. "Old habits," he replied. Walter glanced toward Max, then back at Daniel. There was something careful in his expression, as if he were choosing his words with the same precision he once used to choose tools from a workbench. "I've been thinking," he said. Daniel shifted his weight, already sensing where the conversation might go. "You saved my life," Walter continued. "You saved this house. You brought people back into my world when I'd given up on it." He rested his hand on the arm of the chair, fingers trembling slightly. "And Max?" He paused, swallowing. "Max listens to you, trusts you, more than anyone I've seen besides my son." Max stirred at the sound of his name, lifting his head briefly before settling again, his eyes half open, watching Daniel without moving. Walter met Daniel's gaze. "I want you to take him," he said. "As your dog, as your partner." His voice cracked not from weakness, but from the weight of what the offer meant. "He deserves someone who can keep him safe when I'm gone, someone strong enough to handle what he still carries." Daniel felt the words land heavily in his chest. For a moment he said nothing. He had known this day might come, had prepared arguments in his mind, had told himself he would respond calmly. But standing there with the heater humming, and Max breathing steadily in sleep, the choice felt more personal than he expected. He crouched slowly beside Max, careful not to startle him. The dog's eyes opened fully, now dark and alert, meeting Daniel's with quiet understanding. Daniel reached out and rested his hand against Max's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth beneath the thick fur. "You're a good boy," Daniel murmured. Max's tail thumped once gently against the rug. Daniel looked up at Walter. "I can't," he said softly. Walter frowned. "You don't owe me an explanation, I know," Daniel replied. "But I want to give you one." He glanced back at Max, then around the room. "Max isn't looking for a new partner. He already has one." Walter's expression tightened, emotion flickering across his face. This house, Daniel continued, this chair, this heater, this quiet. This is his home. He spent his life following orders, watching doors, waiting for danger. He earned this. Daniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his conviction. He doesn't need another badge, another set of commands. He needs to stay right where he belongs. Max shifted closer to Walter's chair, resting his head against the old man's leg, as if to underscore the truth of Daniel's words. Walter's hand dropped instinctively to the dog's head, fingers brushing the familiar fur. Tears welled unashamed in his eyes. "You're right," Walter whispered. "He never stopped coming home to me." Daniel stood slowly, feeling something inside him loosen a tension he hadn't realized he carried. There was never a sale, he said. Just a man trying to protect what he loved. Outside, the wind moved across the snow-covered field, quieter now, less threatening. Inside, the heater continued its steady hum, the sound of survival turned ordinary. Daniel finished his coffee, set the mug down, and pulled on his gloves. "I should get going," he said. Walter nodded, his grip tightening briefly on Max's fur. "You'll come back?" he said. "Not a question." Daniel paused at the door, looking once more at the old man in his chair and the dog at his feet. "Yeah," he said. "I will." He stepped outside into the cold, the door closing softly behind him. Max did not follow. He did not stand. He stayed where he was, exactly where he was meant to be. The story did not end with sirens or headlines or miracles whispered through the town. It ended with warmth, where there had been cold, with life, where there had nearly been loss, and with a choice made quietly at the right moment between people who had once been strangers. And that was enough. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm disappears, but that God places the right person in its path at the exact moment it matters. In a world that often feels rushed, divided, and cold, this story reminds us that compassion is still alive and faith still works quietly through ordinary people. Walter did not survive because of wealth or power. Max did not protect because he was commanded. And Daniel did not help because it was easy. They were guided by something deeper, love, loyalty, and a calling written long before that winter day. In our own lives, we may never face frozen streets or life or death choices, but every day we are given moments to choose kindness over comfort, courage over distance. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you that you are never alone.